Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back through the thick, misty curtains of time to explore a side of history that your high school textbooks completely ignored: the wonderful, slightly terrifying world of medieval junk food. Picture yourself standing right in the middle of a bustling, chaotic 14th century London market square, where the air is a heavy, swirling cocktail of burning wood, damp wool, mud, and the surprisingly enticing aroma of sizzling grease. You are surrounded by a sea of colorful, loud humanity, and your stomach is rumbling. But instead of a modern drive through, you are staring at a row of wooden shacks with grease stained counters. Honestly, looking at some of these open air cooking setups, you probably wouldn't survive a single week living on this diet without modern antibiotics, but the smells pulling you in are undeniably comforting. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you are listening to this to unwind, drop a comment down below letting me know where you are tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world right now. I always love reading them. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you take your first cautious steps into the damp mud of the market street, the first thing that strikes you is just how loud and sensory everything is. You lean against a wooden post, watching a cook flip small, sizzling items on a flat iron griddle over an open fire, the sparks drifting lazily into the gray sky. This isn't the grand feast of a king with roasted peacocks and silver platters. This is the fast food of the working class, the quick calories grabbed by a tired blacksmith or a peasant who just hauled a cart of hay 5 miles into the city. You see, the concept of grabbing a quick, greasy bite to eat on the go is absolutely not a modern invention. In fact, medieval cities were packed to the brim with fast food joints because the average person living in a crowded tenement building didn't actually have a kitchen, let alone a chimney or a proper oven. Fire was a constant hazard in these wooden cities, so local governments strictly banned cooking at home for the poorer classes. This meant that if you wanted something warm and comforting after a long day of medieval labor, you had to walk out into the chilly evening air and find a street vendor. The vendors, known back then as pie bakers or cook shops, operated out of tiny stalls that opened directly onto the street, functioning exactly like a modern takeaway window. You watch a young apprentice wipe his hands on a questionable apron as he yells out the prices of his hot pies, his voice competing with the distant tolling of a church bell. The sheer scale of the fast food industry in medieval London or Paris was massive, serving thousands of hungry citizens every single day. Interestingly, one of the most common fast foods available was simply hot meat, cooked and kept warm on a sputtering iron stove. It was cheap, it was greasy, and it was engineered to give you an immediate burst of energy so you could go back to lifting heavy wooden beams or weaving wool. While we often imagine medieval people eating nothing but bland porridge or grand roasts, the reality of street food was wonderfully varied and highly seasoned. The cooks loved using spices, not just for the flavor, but because they believed it helped balance the bodily humors, which was the cutting edge medical science of the day. If you were feeling cold and sluggish, a heavily peppered meat snack was exactly what the local doctor would recommend to kickstart your internal fire. As you stand there, observing the thick smoke rise from the griddle, you notice that the grease dripping from the meat makes the fire flare up in bright, brief flashes, casting a warm orange glow over the damp cobblestones. But there is a catch to this convenient medieval dining experience that makes you hesitate before ordering. Because there was no refrigeration, street cooks were notorious for using whatever meat was cheapest, closest to spoiling, or perhaps a little mysterious in origin. Historians still debate whether the notorious reputation of medieval fast food cooks was entirely earned or just a result of snobbery from wealthy writers who could afford private chefs. Some old court records show that vendors were regularly caught trying to disguise the taste of slightly turning meat by burying it under a mountain of cheap black pepper, garlic, and vinegar. It was the ultimate culinary gamble, a high stakes game of roulette played with your digestive tract. Yet, despite the risks, the sheer convenience kept the stalls packed from sunrise until the night watchman blew his horn for curfew. You watch a group of laborers gather around a stall, laughing softly as they pass around small wrappers made of cheap parchment, grease soaking through the paper, just like a bag of modern French fries. There is a deep, comforting rhythm to the scene. The rhythmic chopping of firewood, the bubbling of fat in iron pans, and the low murmur of gossip shared over a quick meal. It reminds you that no matter how much technology changes, humanity's desire for a warm, savory, effortless snack at the end of a tiring day remains completely unchanged. You breathe in the smoky air, your eyes growing a little heavy from the rhythmic sights and sounds of the market as you prepare to discover what secrets are hidden inside the most popular snack of the entire Middle Ages. You continue to stroll down the muddy lane, your eyes are drawn to a mountain of golden brown pastry domes stacked neatly on a grease slicked wooden counter. This is the undisputed king of medieval fast food, the meat pie. But before you imagine a delicate, flaky crust that melts in your mouth, you need to understand that this pastry shell wasn't designed for enjoyment. In the 14th century, these sturdy, thick walls of flour and water were known as coffins. The name sounds a bit grim for a dinner item, but it was purely functional. These crusts were practically as hard as rock, baked explicitly to serve as disposable Tupperware for the meat sealed inside. You watch a customer casually crack open the top of one of these pastry boxes, using a small wooden spoon to scoop out the steaming, spiced filling inside, before tossing the empty, rock hard crust into the mud for a passing pig to chew on. It was an incredibly clever system for a world without plastic wrap or refrigerators. The the dense, thick crust kept air out, allowing the meat to stay relatively fresh and edible for days or even weeks as it sat on a vendor's shelf. You can hear the rhythmic thump thump of a baker down the alleyway using his heavy wooden rolling pin to smash dough into these rigid shapes. However, because the meat inside was completely hidden from view, the medieval meat pie was also the source of endless urban legends and deep public suspicion. People were always quietly terrified of what the pie bakers were actually slipping into their mixtures. It was the ultimate mystery meat situation, and the general public view of street bakers was remarkably similar to how we joke about modern gas station sushi. In fact, the local city courts had to constantly step in to keep these pie makers from poisoning the population. There are fascinating public records from medieval London detailing the strict laws surrounding the fast food trade. For instance, bakers were legally forbidden from putting rabbit, goose, or garbage tier organ meats into their pies and passing them off as expensive beef or venison. Historians still debate whether these strict regulations were actually effective or if the bakers simply got better at hiding their culinary crimes under heavier layers of cloves and cinnamon. You see, spices weren't just a luxury for the rich. Street vendors used cheap, heavily imported ginger and pepper to mask any funky flavors that might tip off a customer that their lunch had been sitting on a shelf for a bit too long. You stop for a moment to watch a stray cat sit patiently near a pie stall, its tail twitching slowly as it eyes a piece of discarded crust. The vendor, a stout man with flour dusting his eyebrows, ignores the cat as he uses a pair of iron tongs to rearrange his hot inventory closer to the embers. The warmth radiating from his large stone oven hits your face, a welcome relief from the damp evening air. You can smell the rich, heavy scent of pork fat, nutmeg, and stale ale drifting from the open doorway behind him. It's a comforting, deeply savory aroma that completely fills the narrow alley, making it easy to see why someone would ignore the health risks just to have a warm meal in their hands. If you were a medieval laborer with just a few copper coins to your name, you would probably opt for the penny pie. This was the standard, no frills, blue collar lunch of the era. For 1 penny, you got a hand sized pastry packed with minced mutton or pork, heavily salted, to ensure it didn't spoil during your shift. You can see a young carpenter sitting on a wooden bench nearby, holding his penny pie with a piece of dirty cloth to keep from burning his fingers. He bites into it with a look of pure satisfaction, completely unbothered by the fact that the meat might have been walking around the city streets a few days prior. Remember the questionable meat hygiene we talked about earlier? Well, if a baker was caught selling rotten pies, the medieval justice system had a wonderfully poetic way of handling things. Instead of a boring fine, the crooked baker would be placed in the public pillory in the middle of the market. The city guards would then take all of his rotten, smelly pies and burn them right beneath his nose, forcing him to inhale the horrific stench of his own bad cooking, while the townspeople laughed and threw mud at him. It was a highly effective, deeply embarrassing form of consumer protection. As you watch the smoke from the bakery chimney drift lazily into the twilight, you can't help but appreciate the sheer chaos and creativity of this ancient fast food ecosystem, where survival and deliciousness walked hand in hand down every single street. Leaving the pie baker behind, you follow a sharp, distinct aroma that cuts through the heavy smoke of the market, the unmistakable scent of hot oil and fried seafood. You walk down toward the riverbanks, where the ground becomes slicker with moisture and the sound of lapping water mixes with the sizzle of iron vats. Here, long before the iconic British fish and chips became a staple of modern paper-wrapped comfort food, medieval street vendors were operating their own version of the fast food seafood bucket. They specialized in frying up tiny, inexpensive fish pulled straight from the local rivers, coating them in a simple batter of flour and stale ale before dropping them into boiling pots of lard. You watch a vendor lift a wire basket filled with these crispy golden brown little fish, shaking off the excess grease onto a bed of fresh straw. These bite sized snacks were incredibly popular because they were cheap, filling, and perfectly legal to eat during the countless religious fasting days when red meat was strictly forbidden by the church. You see a group of dock workers sitting on an upturned wooden boat, casually tossing these whole for whole fried fish into their mouths like modern popcorn chicken, bones and all. The crunch is audible over the soft chatter of the evening crowd. Because these fish were so small, mostly minnows, gudgeon, and tiny eels, there was no point in trying to fillet them. You just ate the entire thing in one or two savory bites while it was still piping hot and glistening with fat. It was a brilliant way to utilize the natural bounty of the local waterways, which were absolutely teeming with life back then. However, the convenience of these riverside fry shops came with a heavy dose of environmental reality. Historians still debate whether the heavy pollution in medieval urban rivers affected the taste of these fried treats, or if the sheer volume of salt and vinegar the vendors dumped on top washed away any murky flavors. The local authorities were constantly trying to regulate where these fishmongers dumped their leftover oil and fish guts, as the smell could easily overpower an entire neighborhood on a warm, stagnant summer evening. But to the average hungry person walking home in the chilly twilight, that oily fragrance was like a beacon of pure warmth. You step closer to one of the sizzling vats, feeling the intense heat radiate against your skin, a cozy contrast to the damp breeze blowing off the water. The vendor uses a long wooden slotted spoon to skim the surface of the fat, her face glistening with a mixture of sweat and grease. She offers a small ceramic bowl filled with fried eels to a customer, splashing a generous amount of sharp fermented verjuice, a sour liquid made from unripened grapes, over the top to cut through the heavy richness of the lard. The combination of crispy batter, fatty fish, and acidic juice is a culinary formula that has survived for nearly 1,000 years for a very simple reason. It is deeply satisfying to human biology. As you watch the oil bubble and pop, casting tiny droplets that hiss as they hit the damp ground, you notice how this riverside fast food creates its own little community. People from all walks of life, from traveling monks to wealthy merchants who secretly love street food, stand side by side, waiting for the next batch to emerge from the cauldron. There is no pretense here. You eat with your fingers. You wipe the grease on your sleeves, and you don't ask too many questions about which specific part of the river the catch came from. If a fishmonger was caught selling fish that had gone soft and slimy before hitting the oil, the community took it very personally. In many medieval towns, a dishonest fish vendor would be paraded through the streets on a wooden cart with the stinking, rotten fish strung together like a horrific necklace around their shoulders. It was a smelly, humiliating reminder that while street food was fast and casual, cheating your neighbors was a serious public offense. You watch the last few bits of batter turn a deep, rich brown in the bubbling lard, the steam rising to blend with the river mist, as your mind begins to wonder what kind of sweet treats these medieval citizens sought out to balance all this salt and grease. Leaving the riverbanks behind, you turn back toward the heart of the town, where the savory smell of fried fish slowly gives way to something remarkably sweet and fragrant. If you think the medieval world was completely devoid of sugar rushes, you are in for a pleasant surprise, though their version of candy would look entirely foreign to a modern eye. People back then had an incredibly powerful collective sweet tooth, but because refined white sugar was an insanely expensive luxury imported from the Middle East, costing almost a month's wages for a tiny loaf, the common folk had to get creative to get their fix. You watch a street baker pull a massive dark sheet of gingerbread out of a brick oven, the surface bubbling with a thick, glossy sheen. This medieval gingerbread wasn't a light, fluffy cookie shaped like a little man. It was a dense, heavy, almost brick-like confection made from stale breadcrumbs, boiled wild honey, and a massive amount of ground ginger, black pepper, and cinnamon. It was so thick and chewy that you could probably use a slab of it to repair a leaky roof in an emergency. You watch a young girl break off a small piece, chewing it slowly with an expression of intense concentration as the heavy spices kick in. Because honey was the primary sweetener available to the masses, medieval sweet treats always carried a deep, earthy, almost smoky flavor profile, a far cry from the clean sweetness of modern corn syrup. To satisfy their late night sugar cravings, the average townsperson would usually look for vendors selling stewed fruits or candied nuts. You walk past a stall where a large copper pot sits over a low, glowing bed of charcoal. Inside, whole pears and apples are simmering lazily in a thick syrup made of cheap red wine, honey, and cloves. The fruit looks translucent and soft, absorbing the deep crimson color of the liquid. Historians still debate whether these stewed fruits were actually considered a healthy dietary choice, or if medieval doctors viewed them as a dangerous indulgence that caused an imbalance in stomach acid. Most medical texts of the time warned that raw fruit was cold and moist, which could cause your digestion to completely stall, so cooking it in hot spices and wine was seen as a vital safety measure. You stop to watch the vendor use a long wooden ladle to scoop a steaming syrup-drenched pear onto a flat piece of hard, stale bread, which acts as a primitive plate. The syrup slowly soaks into the bread, turning it into a rich, sweet, pudding-like treat that you can eat with your fingers. The sweet, spiced steam rises directly into your face, smelling incredibly comforting in the cool night air. It's a sensory experience that feels deeply cozy, the kind of heavy, warm snack that naturally makes your eyelids feel just a little bit heavier with every breath you take. For those who wanted something a bit more portable, there were vendors who specialized in comfits, which were essentially the ancestors of modern jawbreakers or M&Ms. These were tiny seeds, usually fennel, anise, or coriander, that were painstakingly coated in dozens of layers of melted sugar syrup until they formed a hard, crunchy shell. You see a wealthy clerk reach into a small leather pouch and pop a handful of these sugar-coated seeds into his mouth, the sharp crack of the candy shell echoing in the quiet street. They were used both as a sweet treat and as a medieval breath mint to cover up the lingering smell of onions, stale ale, and questionable meat pies. Of course, the obsession with these dense, sticky sweets meant that dental hygiene in the Middle Ages was an absolute nightmare, especially for the wealthy who could afford actual sugar. In a bizarre twist of historical irony, having black, decayed teeth eventually became a status symbol among the upper classes because it proved you were rich enough to buy the expensive white sugar that rotted your mouth out. If a vendor was caught watering down their honey with cheap flour or chalk to make a bigger profit on their sweets, they would face the wrath of the local guild, often being forced to sit in the market square while children threw sticky, spoiled fruit at their heads. You take one last look at the simmering pot of spiced pears, the rich syrup bubbling with lazy, slow pops as the sound of a distant tavern song reminds you that no medieval fast food meal is complete without something to wash it down. Following that distant, rowdy tavern song down a narrow, winding alleyway, you encounter an aroma that is virtually synonymous with medieval urban life: the sour, yeasty, deeply comforting smell of fresh street ale. In the 14th century, you couldn't just turn on a tap to get a glass of clean water. Urban rivers were essentially public sewers, meaning that everyone, from toddlers to grandparents, drank ale to stay hydrated. But the stuff sold on the street corners wasn't the crisp, clear, filtered lager you might find in a modern bottle. This was medieval street ale, a thick, cloudy, unhopped beverage that looked more like liquid bread or a hearty oat smoothie than a modern beer. You watch a woman lift a heavy wooden bucket out of her cellar, a thick layer of creamy, bubbling yeast frothing over the rim as she prepares to sell it directly to the passing crowd. These street brewers were almost exclusively women, known affectionately as alewives or brewsters. Brewing was a domestic chore that could easily be turned into a quick, profitable side hustle. When an alewife finished a fresh batch of brew in her kitchen, she would hang a long wooden pole with a bunch of green leaves on the end, called an ale stake, out of her front window. This was the universal medieval bat signal for, "The beer is hot and ready, come and get it." You see a line of tired laborers immediately gather outside her door, holding out their own ceramic jugs, leather jacks, or wooden bowls to be filled with the murky, warm liquid. It was cheap, highly caloric, and served as both a hydrating beverage and a liquid junk food that could dull the aches of a 12-hour workday. Because hops had not yet become a standard ingredient in England or parts of France, this ale went sour very quickly, usually within a few days of brewing. To mask the sourness and add flavor, alewives threw in a wild assortment of herbs and spices known as grout, which could include anything from rosemary and thyme to bog myrtle, long pepper, or even dried orange peel if they could get it. Historians still debate whether some of these secret herb mixtures had mild hallucinogenic properties, or if the strange visions reported by medieval drinkers were just the result of drinking fermented grain that had been contaminated with ergot fungus. Either way, a pint of this thick, spiced ale would hit your system fast, delivering a heavy dose of B vitamins and a warm, fuzzy buzz that made the cold, damp evening feel instantly cozy. You watch an old soldier sit down on a wooden bench, leaning his head against the stone wall as he takes a long, slow sip from a leather tankard. The ale leaves a thick, creamy mustache of foam on his lip, which he wipes away with a contented sigh. The atmosphere around the ale stake is relaxed and low-key. People aren't here to get violently drunk, but rather to unwind, share the day's gossip, and let the heavy carbohydrates settle in their bellies. The low, rhythmic murmur of their voices, combined with the occasional slosh of liquid in wooden barrels, creates a soothing, hypnotic background hum that echoes softly through the alleyway. However, because ale was an absolute necessity of life, the local government watched these street corner breweries like a hawk. Every town had a dedicated official known as an ale conner. This job sounds like a modern dream, but it was a serious civic duty. The ale conner's job was to walk around the city, taste every single batch of fresh ale, and ensure it was being sold at the legally mandated price and strength. According to local legend, an ale conner would test the quality of the brew by pouring a small puddle of it onto a clean wooden bench, sitting down in it while wearing tight leather breeches and waiting for a few minutes. If he stood up and the bench stuck to his pants because of the excess unfermented sugar, it meant the alewife was cheating her customers with a poor quality brew. If an alewife was caught selling watered-down sour or overpriced ale, she would have to face the tumbrel, a wooden cart that would parade her through the market square while the angry locals jeered. In some extreme cases, dishonest brewers would be fastened to a chair and dunked straight into the murky, chilly waters of the local river to cool their entrepreneurial greed. You watch the alewife hand over one last wooden mug of the frothy amber liquid, the warm glow of her hearth fire spilling out into the dark street, as your feet carry you toward another corner of the market, where a surprisingly wholesome and salty snack is being twisted into shape. Eaving the aromatic alleyway of the alewife, you wander into a quiet, shadowy courtyard tucked behind the towering stone walls of a nearby monastery. The heavy, yeast-scented air of the street transitions into something incredibly comforting. The rich, warm smell of toasted flour, coarse salt, and fresh dough. This is where one of the most enduring, universally loved snacks in human history was perfected. Long before it became a salty staple of modern sporting events or shopping malls, The soft pretzel was a deeply spiritual, highly addictive creation of early medieval monks. You look through a low arched window into the monastery kitchen, where a gentle fire casts a flickering orange glow over long wooden tables. There, a monk in a coarse brown wool robe is working with incredible speed, his flour dusted hands twisting long ropes of dough into a very specific, familiar shape. The design of the pretzel wasn't an accident, it was an incredibly clever piece of religious marketing. In the early Middle Ages, a creative monk realized that if you twisted a strip of dough so that the ends crossed over and tucked under, the resulting three holes perfectly resembled a person crossing their arms in prayer over their chest. These baked goods were originally called bracellae, a Latin term meaning little arms, which eventually evolved over centuries into the modern word pretzel. You watch the monk drop the freshly twisted dough shapes into a large steaming cauldron of boiling water spiked with wood ash lye, a traditional technique that gives the snack its iconic glossy brown skin and distinct slightly sharp flavor when baked. These early soft pretzels were initially handed out as a reward to local children who successfully memorized their prayers and Bible verses, making them the ultimate medieval equivalent of a gold star sticker. However, the sheer deliciousness of these salty, chewy creations couldn't be kept secret behind monastery walls for long. Soon enough, enterprising monks and town bakers realized that the public was absolutely desperate to buy them as a casual street food. Historians still debate whether the massive popularity of pretzels across Central Europe was due to their religious symbolism, or if it was simply because they were incredibly cheap to produce using basic ingredients like flour, water, and salt. Because they contained no eggs or butter, they were the perfect guilt-free junk food to gorge on during Lent when almost all other delicious, comforting foods were strictly banned by church law. You watch as the monk pulls a long wooden paddle out of the massive stone oven, carrying a dozen piping hot, deeply browned pretzels that are glistening with coarse crystals of sea salt. The intense heat radiating from the oven feels wonderful against the cool evening air, warming your face and hands as you lean closer to the window. The salt crystals catch the light of the fire like tiny diamonds embedded in the dark, baked crust. When you bite into one of these fresh street pretzels, the exterior gives way with a satisfying, chewy resistance, revealing a soft, steaming, pillowy interior that melts on your tongue. It is a perfect balance of salt, warmth, and carbohydrates, the ultimate comfort food designed to make you feel instantly grounded and relaxed. Because pretzels became a core part of the daily urban diet, the bakers who made them held a massive amount of responsibility in the community. If a baker tried to cheat the system during a bad harvest by secretly shrinking the size of their pretzels while charging the same price, the local town guild would take immediate, highly public action. A dishonest baker would be locked inside a sturdy wooden basket attached to a long wooden pole and repeatedly dunked into the town's muddiest pond. It was a soggy, humiliating punishment that ensured everyone knew exactly who was trying to shortchange the neighborhood's favorite snack. You take a deep breath of the toasty, bready aroma drifting from the monastery kitchen, your mind drifting into a state of pure, quiet contentment as you prepare to follow the soft, crackling sound of an open fire just around the corner. Eaving the peaceful monastery courtyard, you slide back into the main thoroughfare of the night market, where the chilly evening breeze is suddenly cut by a wave of dry, intense heat and a sound that makes you instantly want to slow your pace: the rhythmic, gentle crack, pop, snap of glowing charcoal. You trace the sound to a street corner bathed in a warm, amber light, where a vendor stands over a large, shallow iron brazier filled with white-hot embers. Resting directly on top of the glowing coals is a heavy, black cast iron pan with small holes punched through the bottom, and inside, hundreds of plump, glossy chestnuts are slowly turning a deep, rich mahogany color. You watch the vendor use a long wooden paddle to agitate the nuts, sending a soft cascade of bright orange sparks drifting lazily up into the dark sky like miniature stars. Roasting chestnuts on open street fires was the ultimate seasonal comfort food of the Middle Ages, cutting across every single social class from the dirt poor peasant to the highest noble. For the working class, chestnuts were a literal lifesaver during the lean winter months when grain prices skyrocketed, earning them the nickname the bread of the woods. But when roasted over an open fire by a street vendor, they transformed into a highly addictive, sweet, and smoky junk food that people bought by the handful to warm their freezing fingers. You see a wealthy merchant, wrapped in a heavy fur coat, stop at the stall, casually tossing a couple of silver coins to the vendor, who scoops a generous portion of the steaming nuts into a conical pouch made of rough, dark wool fabric. The vendor uses a small, sharp knife to slice a deep cross into the skin of each chestnut before they hit the heat, an absolutely vital safety step that keeps them from exploding like tiny hand grenades under the intense pressure of the steam inside. Historians still debate whether the widespread medieval belief that chestnuts could cure headaches and soothe an upset stomach had any actual scientific basis, or if it was just a comforting psychological effect of eating something so warm, sweet, and filling on a miserable, freezing night. To the modern observer, it's just pure, uncomplicated comfort food. The natural sugars inside the nut caramelize against the intense heat of the cast iron pan, creating a flavor that is deeply sweet, intensely nutty, and heavily kissed by the clean smoke of burning hardwood. You step closer to the brazier, letting the waves of dry heat wash over your face and chest, melting away the damp chill that has been creeping into your bones all evening. The aroma is intoxicating, a rich, earthy sweetness combined with the cozy scent of charred wood and roasting starch that completely dominates the street corner. As you watch, the vendor cracks open one of the freshly roasted shells, peeling away the brittle, blackened outer skin to reveal the steaming golden yellow meat inside, which has a soft, almost buttery texture that practically dissolves in your mouth. The sheer warmth of holding the paper pouch in your hands acts like a pair of instant, portable gloves, radiating heat directly into your palms. Because chestnuts were such a vital resource for the city's survival during the winter, the local foresters and lords who owned the surrounding woodlands guarded their chestnut groves with an iron fist. Sneaking into a lord's forest after dark to collect wild chestnuts without paying a tax was a serious crime, though desperate peasants tried it every single year, hiding their stashes in deep fabric pockets sewn inside their cloaks. If a street vendor was caught using a weighted scale to give their customers fewer chestnuts than they paid for, the punishment was swift. The local marketplace guards would confiscate their entire iron brazier and dump the white-hot coals directly into the mud at their feet, ruining their business for the night. You watch the vendor throw another handful of fresh nuts onto the sizzling iron, the slow, tight, hypnotic rhythm of the crackling fire wrapping around your senses like a heavy wool blanket as you prepare to investigate the surprisingly strict laws governing the rest of the medieval fast food trade. As you step away from the comforting warmth of the chestnut brazier, you find yourself walking past a row of stone storefronts where the rhythmic, heavy thud of wooden dough mixers echoes into the damp night. This brings you straight into the surprisingly high stakes, deeply bureaucratic world of medieval fast food safety. If you think modern food inspections and health codes are a product of the 21st century, the medieval legal system is about to surprise you. Back in the 14th century, the bread and snacks you bought on the street were so vital to public survival that the government regulated them with an iron fist through a legendary law known as the Assize of Bread and Ale. You watch a man in an official-looking tunic, holding a long parchment scroll and a brass scale, step into a bakery stall to check the weight of the fresh loaves sitting on the counter. This wasn't just a casual checkup. It was a matter of life and death for the urban working class. The Assize dictated exactly how much a loaf of bread or a meat pie could cost, and exactly how heavy it had to be based on the current price of grain harvested in the countryside. Because grain prices fluctuated wildly with the weather, bakers were under constant temptation to secretly cheapen their recipes. To save money, some dishonest street vendors would mix sawdust, ground chalk, or even swept up floor dirt into their flour to bulk up the weight of their dough. Historians still debate whether these filler ingredients were added out of pure malicious greed or absolute desperation during years of terrible famine when real flour was virtually impossible to find. To prevent this kind of culinary sabotage, the city employed full-time food inspectors who would crawl through bakery windows unannounced in the middle of the night. If an inspector found a baker using tainted ingredients or shortchanging the public on weight, the legal consequences were beautifully, ruthlessly public. You see, the medieval justice system didn't believe in boring fines or hidden prison sentences. They believed in maximum public embarrassment. A corrupt baker would be tied securely to a wooden sled with the tiny illegal loaves of bread strung around their neck like a ridiculous tie. The city guards would then drag them by a horse through the muddiest, filthiest streets of the town, while neighbors lined up to jeer, laugh, and pelt them with their own spoiled dough. You stop to watch an honest baker carefully measure out his dough on a set of iron scales, his movements slow and methodical in the dim light of a tallow candle. The air inside his shop is thick with a fine white mist of flour that catches the light like tiny floating dust motes. There is a deep, comforting rhythm to his work. The steady slap, fold, turn of the dough against the smooth oak table, followed by the soft shuck of his wooden paddle sliding the loaves into the dark mouth of the stone oven. The smell of rising yeast and clean wheat fills the small space, creating a soothing sanctuary of productivity in the middle of the chaotic city night. It was this extreme risk of public humiliation that actually gave birth to one of our favorite modern phrases, the baker's dozen. Because the punishments for selling underweight bread were so incredibly severe, bakers became utterly terrified of making an accidental mathematical error when a customer ordered 12 rolls. To absolutely guarantee they wouldn't get dragged through the mud on a wooden sled, they began throwing in a 13th roll completely for free as an insurance policy. It was a brilliant, highly effective solution born out of pure legal terror. If a street vendor tried to run away from the inspectors or lie about where they sourced their meat and flour, the local guild would permanently strip them of their license, smashing their wooden stalls into splinters right in the center of the market square. You watch the honest baker close his heavy wooden shutters for the evening, the soft golden light of his hearth fire narrowing to a thin sliver on the wet cobblestones, as you continue your midnight stroll toward a stall that is pressing out a crispy, delicate snack that people absolutely obsessed over. The sound of the heavy wooden shutters sliding into place fades behind you as you follow a delicate, sweet fragrance that seems to float directly over the damp cobblestones. It smells of melted butter, toasted sugar, and a hint of orange blossom water. You turn a sharp corner and find yourself standing before a stall that is entirely illuminated by a fierce, concentrated heat source. A street vendor, his face bathed in a dramatic crimson glow, is holding a pair of long, heavy iron tongs that terminate in two large, flat, rectangular plates. This is the medieval waffle stall, a place where people from every walk of life gather to indulge in an absolute obsession, the goaf, or wafer. You watch the vendor squeeze the long iron handles together with a satisfying clink, a small hiss of steam escaping from the sides as a tiny dollop of batter expands between the hot metal plates. These heavy waffle irons were beautifully crafted pieces of metallurgy, often featuring intricate designs carved directly into the interior surface of the iron. As you step closer, you can see that the plates are engraved with elaborate geometric patterns, family crests, or even short religious proverbs written in reverse. When the thin batter, made from fine wheat flour, eggs, water, and milk, is pressed between them over a bed of white-hot charcoal, the design is instantly stamped into the crispy surface of the pastry. It was the ultimate medieval branding experience. You watch a young clerk hand over a tiny lead token to the vendor, receiving a wafer that looks almost like a piece of edible lace, so thin and delicate that you can see the light of the fire glowing through the pattern. These crispy wafers were the premier on-the-go snack for medieval citizens who wanted a quick, elegant hit of sweetness without the heavy, jaw-breaking density of the gingerbread we encountered earlier. Historians still debate whether the massive popularity of these wafer stalls was due to their affordability or if people were simply hooked on the theatrical nature of the cooking process itself. Watching a skilled wafer maker was pure street theater. They would swing the heavy irons over the coals with hypnotic, rhythmic precision, turning them at the exact second required to ensure both sides achieved a perfect, uniform golden brown coloration without a single patch of char. You lean your back against a cold stone wall, letting the intense, radiant heat of the wafer maker's charcoal brazier warm your front. The contrast is incredibly cozy, a safe pocket of warmth in the cool, humid night air. The aroma is purely intoxicating. It's the scent of a modern bakery distilled into its most primal, wood-fired form. You watch the vendor use a small flat to gently pry the finished wafer off the iron plate. It is initially soft and pliable, but within seconds of hitting the cool night air, it cools into a perfectly rigid, wonderfully crunchy sheet of sweet, starchy goodness. People would buy them in stacks, eating them layer by layer as they wandered through the darkening market lanes. Because these wafer irons were so heavy and expensive to forge, the people who owned them formed a highly exclusive guild known as the Gaufriers. They fiercely protected their right to sell these crispy treats, especially during major public festivals and church holidays when the demand for street snacks reached a fever pitch. In fact, competition between rival wafer vendors was so incredibly fierce that the local city governments had to pass strict laws forbidding stalls from being set up within a certain number of yards of one another. If two wafer makers set up their braziers too close together, it almost always resulted in a chaotic street brawl, with vendors swinging their hot, heavy iron tongues at each other like medieval knights wielding warhammers. If a rogue vendor was caught using cheap, sour milk or watered-down eggs to stretch their wafer batter, the guild took immediate action to protect their industry's reputation. The dishonest vendor would have their precious iron stamps seized by the guildmasters and publicly smashed with a sledgehammer on the courthouse steps, ensuring they could never cook in the city again. You watch the vendor pour another small ladle of smooth, cream-colored batter onto the dark, seasoned iron, the slow, rhythmic hiss of the escaping steam acting like a gentle sigh that echoes perfectly into the quiet, starlit night as you prepare to discover what happened when the taverns finally locked their doors. The delicate fragrance of toasted sugar and orange blossom water slowly evaporates into the chilly night breeze as you walk further away from the guild stalls down into the deeper, shadowier corridors of the entertainment district. The grand church bells have long since chimed the hour of curfew, and the heavy wooden doors of the authorized taverns are being barred from the inside. This is the hour of the midnight craving, a time when intoxicated townspeople, exhausted actors, and late shift watchmen stumble out into the dark cobblestone alleys looking for a greasy, heavily spiced fix to settle their stomachs. You watch a rowdy group of university students lean against a stone wall, laughing uproariously as they pool their remaining copper coins to buy a late-night bowl of pottage from a shadowy cookshop that stays open long past the legal limits. This late-night street food was the medieval world's answer to the modern 2 a.m. diner run or the greasy takeaway box. The primary offering for someone with a severe case of the midnight munchies was a dish known as restorative brew, or highly spiced leftover stew. Cookshops would keep a massive, blackened iron cauldron simmering over a low bed of embers for days on end, continually tossing in the leftover scraps of meat, wilted cabbage leaves, broken bits of bread, and heavy handfuls of onions that hadn't sold during the daytime market rush. You watch the cook use a massive wooden ladle to stir the thick, bubbling concoction, the heavy movement revealing chunks of unpeeled carrots and floating pockets of rich, glistening fat that catch the yellow light of his grease lamp. To make this questionable mixture appealing to a drunk and exhausted clientele, the cook would dump in a massive amount of hot, sharp condiments. They used heavy quantities of yellow mustard seed, wild garlic, and cheap fermented vinegar to give the stew a massive punch that could cut through any amount of stale ale or wine a customer had consumed. Historians still debate whether these late-night cookshops were actually legal enterprises or if they operated entirely in a black market economy, bribing the night watchmen with bowls of hot soup to look the other way after the city's official closing hours. To the hungry souls wandering the dark streets, however, that steaming bowl was pure, uncomplicated salvation. You step into the shallow overhang of the cookshop's roof, sheltering yourself from a light drizzle that has begun to fall, making the wet cobblestones glisten like black ice. The warmth rising from the massive iron pot hits your face in thick, humid waves, carrying the intensely savory, sharp aroma of boiled leeks, cracked pepper, and rich beef tallow. It is a heavy, primal smell that completely dominates the narrow alleyway, creating a cozy oasis of warmth in the middle of a dark, sleeping city. You watch a customer hold the hot ceramic bowl with both hands, using his fingers to scoop out the thick chunks of meat before drinking the spicy vinegary broth straight over the rim with a loud, satisfied sigh. For those who wanted something a bit more solid to soak up their late night drinks, the cook offered pigas in saws, which were essentially boiled pig's feet or ears preserved in a sharp, heavily salted gelatin mixture, spiked with sage and parsley. It was the ultimate salty, fatty comfort food, designed to trigger a heavy wave of drowsiness that would help a laborer pass out on their straw mattress within minutes of getting home. The sheer density of the food, combined with the rhythmic, low bubbling of the cauldron, creates a deeply hypnotic atmosphere that makes your own eyelids feel heavy and relaxed. If a late night cook was caught recycling scraps that were visibly turning green or using meat from animals that had died of disease in the countryside, the city's midnight watch took a very dim view of their late night entrepreneurship. The dishonest cook would be dragged out of their stall and forced to stand in the public square the following morning, with the offending pot of stinking stew poured directly over their head so that the rancid fat would coat their clothes and hair for days. You watch the cook throw a fresh log onto the dying embers beneath his cauldron, the wood catching with a slow, deep crackle as you prepare to transition from these muddy, greasy alleys into the dazzling, surreal world of elite royal junk food. Eaving the dark, rain-slicked alleyway of the midnight cookshop, you step through a massive arched stone gateway and find yourself transported into a completely different realm of medieval indulgence. The smell of boiling leeks and cheap vinegar instantly vanishes, replaced by the delicate, intoxicating scent of rosewater, spun sugar, and costly musk. You have slipped past the guards and into the great hall of a royal castle during a grand feast. While the working class outside was fighting over penny pies and stale gingerbread, the medieval nobility was busy inventing their own form of elite junk food. You look up at the towering timber ceilings, where the flickering light of 100 beeswax candles casts long, dancing shadows across tapestry-covered walls, illuminating a long, high table loaded with desserts that look less like food and more like surreal works of art. At a royal banquet, junk food wasn't just about satisfying a craving, it was a dazzling display of wealth and political power. The absolute pinnacle of these elite sweets was a creation known as a subtlety, or an entremet. These were massive, incredibly intricate sculptures made entirely out of sugar paste, marzipan, and edible gold leaf. You watch a pair of servants carefully carry out a sugar sculpture shaped like a fully detailed Gothic cathedral, complete with tiny, clear sugar windows and miniature marzipan knights guarding the doors. The king casually reaches out and snaps the head off a golden sugar dragon, popping it into his mouth with an expression of pure, careless indulgence. Remember the questionable meat hygiene we encountered down by the muddy riverbanks? Well, up here in the Royal Hall, the only danger to your health is an immediate, overwhelming sugar crash. These elite confectioners used refined white sugar as if it were modeling clay, mixing it with crushed almonds, gum arabic, and expensive imported food flavorings like sandalwood and saffron to create vibrant reds and brilliant yellows. Historians still debate whether these incredibly complex creations were actually meant to be eaten for their flavor, or if they were purely theatrical props designed to make the visiting foreign ambassadors feel intimidated by the host king's bottomless wealth. Sometimes these subtleties weren't even made entirely of food. Royal cooks would occasionally build a giant pastry crust, bake it empty, and then secretly stuff it with live frogs or small songbirds right before serving. When the grand carver sliced open the pie, the birds would burst out into the rafters of the hall, shocking and delighting the noble guests in a display that gave birth to the famous nursery rhyme about 4 and 20 blackbirds. You lean against a thick stone pillar, watching a young noblewoman use a delicate silver pin to pick up a candied violet petal that has been dipped in liquid sugar and left to crystallize into a crunchy purple gem. The warmth in this grand hall is intense, radiating from a massive walk in fireplace where whole oak logs are burning down into a deep, steady bed of crimson coals. The air is thick with the sweet, heavy perfume of burning fruit woods, expensive spices, and the rich, honeyed wine known as hypocras that the servers are pouring into silver goblets. The low, rhythmic strumming of a lute player standing in the corner gallery mixes with the soft, elegant murmur of aristocratic laughter, creating a hypnotic, incredibly soothing blanket of sound that makes the entire scene feel like a beautifully vivid dream. For the young pages and squires working the feast, the leftovers of these sugar sculptures were the ultimate prize. Once the grand lords and ladies had finished picking at the gold leaf towers and marzipan castles, the remnants were carried back into the dark stone kitchens, where the young servants would eagerly scrape the sweet, sticky paste off the platters with their fingers, getting a rare taste of the luxury that was slowly rotting the teeth of the royal court. If a royal master chef failed to impress the king's guests with a sufficiently mind-blowing sugar creation, or if the structure collapsed into a sticky heap on the table before the king could show it off, the chef's career was effectively over, and they might find themselves demoted to peeling onions in the drafty basement kitchens for the rest of their days. You watch a servant place a fresh platter of spiced sugar wafers onto the velvet-covered table, the delicate crystal surfaces catching the golden candlelight like tiny sheets of amber ice, as your journey prepares to take you away from the castle walls and onto the long, dusty trails of the weary medieval traveler. The rich, sweet scent of rosewater and spun sugar begins to fade as you step away from the grand warmth of the royal castle, descending a narrow stone staircase that leads out toward the massive, heavy oak gates of the city walls. The elegant strumming of the castle lute player morphs into the rhythmic, dusty crunch of leather boots hitting a long, unpaved dirt highway that stretches out into the dark, moonlit countryside. You are no longer surrounded by kings or wealthy merchants. You are now walking shoulder to shoulder with the weary, dust-covered masses of medieval travelers, merchants, and deeply pious pilgrims who are journeying hundreds of miles to visit a sacred shrine. Your feet feel heavy after hours of walking, and your throat is dry from the dust kicked up by passing pack mules, but your stomach is empty. Without a modern convenience store or a roadside gas station in sight, you must rely entirely on the specialized, incredibly durable travel junk food carried in the small linen sacks bouncing against your hip. This traveling food was engineered with one single goal in mind: survival through extreme dehydration. Long before modern preservatives or vacuum-sealed plastic packaging, medieval travelers filled their pockets with pocket bread or hard biscuit tack, which was essentially flour and water baked 3 or 4 times until every single molecule of moisture had been completely driven out of the dough. It was so incredibly dense and solid that you could easily use a small chunk of it to drive a copper nail into a wooden post. You watch an elderly pilgrim sit down on a smooth stone milestone by the side of the trail, pulling out a dark, flinty biscuit from his leather pouch. He doesn't even attempt to bite into it directly. Doing so would instantly shatter your teeth, a luxury he certainly cannot afford. Instead, he reaches for a small horn flask containing sour, watered-down wine, dropping the rock-hard biscuit into the liquid and waiting patiently for it to slowly soften into a spongy, edible mush. Because these travel rations were so incredibly bland and exhausting to consume, resourceful travelers created a primitive, highly addictive version of modern trail mix. They would buy cheap dried fruits like shriveled figs, stringy dates, and leathery raisins from market vendors before leaving the city gates, mixing them together with heavily salted, smoke-dried hazelnuts and bitter acorns. It was the ultimate pocket-sized junk food, offering an immediate hit of concentrated natural fructose and heavy fats that could keep a person walking down a dusty road for 12 hours straight without needing to stop to build a cooking fire. Historians still debate whether these long-distance travelers actually suffered from severe vitamin deficiencies on the trail, or if the wild herbs and dried berries they picked along the hedgerows provided just enough nutrients to stave off illness during their months-long spiritual treks. You stop to rest beneath the sprawling branches of a massive ancient oak tree that arches over the road, listening to the soft, rhythmic chirping of hidden crickets and the gentle rustle of leaves in the cool night wind. The cool air feels wonderful against your overheated skin, carrying the crisp, clean scent of damp earth, wild pine needles, and the distant smoky aroma of a traveler's campfire burning low in a nearby field. You reach into your own traveling sack and pull out a handful of these dried fruits and salted nuts, feeling the rough, varied textures against your fingertips before popping them into your mouth. The intense, deep sweetness of the dried figs explodes across your palate, perfectly balanced by the sharp, intense bite of the coarse sea salt crusted onto the smoky hazelnut shells. It is a simple, primal combination that feels incredibly grounded and deeply satisfying after the sensory overload of the city markets. For those who could afford a little extra weight in their packs, the ultimate luxury on a long road trip was a small jar of hard cheese curds. This was milk that had been heavily salted, pressed inside a tight cheesecloth until it was completely dry, and then aged until it turned into a hard, crumbly, and intensely savory nugget that could survive a blistering summer heat wave without melting or rotting in your bag. You can see a young merchant sitting near the dying embers of his small campfire a few yards away, using a short iron knife to shave thin, delicate, translucent ribbons off a wheel of this rock-solid cheese, letting the salty flakes melt slowly on his tongue as he stares sleepily up at the vast field of stars overhead. If an unprincipled street vendor tried to cheat these traveling pilgrims by selling them trail provisions that had secretly become infested with grain weevils or moldy in the center of the sack, they would have to answer to the heavy-handed justice of the church authorities who managed the pilgrim trails. A dishonest merchant caught poisoning the holy travelers would be banned from setting up their stalls anywhere near the sacred highway, or worse, they would be forced to march the entire length of the pilgrimage trail while carrying a heavy wooden board carved with the word thief strapped tightly to their back. You watch the elderly pilgrim finish his softened biscuit mush, wiping his wooden spoon on his sleeve with a long, slow yawn as the deep, rhythmic hum of the nocturnal countryside invites you to discover the incredibly complex, rigid laws that dictated exactly which days you were actually allowed to enjoy these oily, savory treats. The rhythmic, dusty crunch of the pilgrim highway slowly fades into a profound, heavy silence as you find yourself stepping across the threshold of a quiet, candlelit stone kitchen inside a neighborhood parish house. The transition brings you face to face with the incredibly complex, rigid, and often stressful world of medieval religious fasting laws and the highly creative world of banned snacks. In the 14th century, the calendar wasn't just a tool to keep track of the months. It was a spiritual minefield dictated by the church, which mandated that for more than 150 days out of the year, including every Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and the entire 40-day season of Lent, eating the flesh of any warm-blooded animal, along with dairy products like butter, cream, and eggs, was strictly forbidden. You look at a cook standing over a wooden counter, his shoulders slouched with exhaustion as he consults a small parchment calendar, trying to figure out how to satisfy the intense, late-night cravings of a household that is utterly desperate for a rich, oily, and satisfying comfort food on a chilly Friday night. This extreme legal restriction didn't stop people from craving junk food. Instead, it sparked an era of hilarious, boundary-pushing culinary creativity that would make a modern corporate lawyer blush. Because people were completely miserable eating plain, boiled vegetables day after day, medieval cooks became masters of the loophole. If you couldn't use lard or pork fat to fry up a batch of crispy street food, you had to find a loophole in the definition of meat. This led to some truly wild biological classifications. For instance, the church decreed that because barnacle geese hatched from eggs that allegedly dropped into the ocean, they counted as fish, allowing wealthy nobles to gorge on roasted goose during holy days without technically committing a mortal sin. Historians still debate whether the medieval clergy genuinely believed these bizarre animal myths or if everyone, from the bishops down to the village peasants, just collectively agreed to look the other way so they could enjoy a savory, greasy bird on a Friday evening. The absolute pinnacle of fasting day junk food, however, was the invention of mock dairy, made entirely from crushed almonds. Because real butter and animal milk were strictly banned during Lent, street vendors and estate cooks would take massive sacks of imported almonds, grind them into a fine white dust using heavy stone mortars, and mix it with hot water and sugar to create almond milk. They would boil this liquid until it thickened into a rich, creamy paste known as almond butter, which they would slather over pieces of toasted bread or use to fry up thin, crispy pancakes. You see a young servant boy sitting on a low stool near the hearth, carefully grinding nuts, his movements slow and rhythmic as the heavy stone pestle goes scritch, scratch against the mortar. It was an incredibly expensive, highly labor-intensive process, but the resulting treat was so intensely rich, sweet, and comforting that people actually looked forward to the fasting season just so they could gorge on it. You lean your head back against the cool, damp stone of the kitchen wall, watching the bright orange flames of the hearth fire dance lazily across the soot-stained ceiling. The air inside the room is thick with the cozy, intoxicating aroma of toasted almonds, boiled sugar, and the sharp, woody scent of burning applewood logs. The intense heat radiating from the brick oven wraps around you like a heavy, protective blanket, chasing away the dark chill of the night. You watch the cook drop a small ladle of the thick almond batter into a pan of hot linseed oil, watching it hiss, puff up, and turn a beautiful, deep, golden brown color within seconds. It is a slow, deeply hypnotic sight, the lazy bubbles of oil rising and popping softly, releasing a sweet, nutty steam that completely fills the cozy room, making your eyelids feel incredibly heavy with every breath you take. For the poorer working class who couldn't afford expensive imported almonds, the ultimate Friday comfort food was a bowl of salted split peas, boiled down with plenty of wild onions until it reached the dense, greasy consistency of modern refried beans. They would spread this thick, savory paste over hard oat cakes, creating a heavily salted, highly caloric snack that could satisfy their biological craving for fat and starch after a long, grueling day of physical labor. If a street vendor or a local baker was caught secretly sneaking real pork fat into their Friday pastries or selling actual cheese during Lent, the consequences were terrifyingly severe. The offender wouldn't just face a heavy fine from the town magistrates, they would be handed over to the church courts, where they would be forced to perform public penance, walking barefoot through the crowded marketplace on Sunday morning while holding a heavy wax candle and wearing nothing but a rough, itchy linen smock to signify their spiritual corruption to the entire neighborhood. You watch the cook lift the crispy almond pancake from the sizzling pan, setting it gently on a wooden platter where the excess oil glistens softly under the warm, amber glow of the dying embers. As your journey prepares to leave the candlelit kitchen behind to discover the ultimate savory indulgence of the medieval laborer. The sweet, nutty aroma of toasted almond oil fades behind the thick wooden doors of the parish house as you step out into the deep, cool darkness of a rural manor courtyard. The distant tolling of the midnight cathedral bells has long stopped, and the only sound left in the night is the rhythmic, heavy breathing of sleeping livestock in the nearby barns and the crunch of frosted grass beneath your feet. You are entering the rugged, raw, and intensely savory world of medieval dairy delights and cheese curds. For the millions of peasants and agricultural laborers who worked the land from sunrise to sunset, refined sugar sculptures and imported spices were nothing but distant myths. To them, the ultimate comfort food, the junk food that kept them going through the bitterest winters and longest harvests, was a block of unpasteurized, heavily salted, and deeply pungent cheese. You watch an old milkmaid sit on a low stool by a dying hearth in the manor's dairy shed, a single candle casting long, flickering shadows over a massive wooden cheese press as she manually tightens the heavy oak screw. This peasant cheese wasn't the delicate, refined brie or camembert found on a modern charcuterie board. It was known back then as spermie eyes, or green cheese, a freshly made, highly acidic and intensely salty curd cheese that was eaten almost immediately after being pulled from the whey. Because there was no refrigeration, milk from cows, sheep, or goats had to be converted into cheese within hours of milking before it spoiled in the summer heat. To ensure it survived the journey from the pasture to the worker's pouch, the dairy maids would pack the curds with massive fistfuls of coarse gray sea salt. This salt drew out every last drop of moisture, turning the curds into an incredibly dense, crumbly, and intensely sharp, savory snack that acted as a primitive energy bar. You see a tired plowman sitting on an empty grain sack in the corner of the shed, using a small iron dagger to break off thick, jagged nuggets of this salted curd, dropping them onto a slice of dense, dark barley bread. Because this cheese was so cheap and abundant, laborers obsessed over it, finding creative ways to turn it into an indulgent, staff melted fast food at the end of the day. They would take a slab of the hard, salty curd, stick it onto the end of a sharpened wooden branch, and hold it directly over the open flames of a hearth fire until the exterior bubbled, charred, and melted into a gooey, stringy mess. This medieval ancestor of modern grilled cheese or raclette was known as roasted cheese, and its rich, fatty fragrance was absolutely intoxicating to a starving worker. Historians still debate whether the severe, vivid nightmares reported by medieval peasants were actually caused by eating massive quantities of this unpasteurized, highly fermented midnight cheese right before bed, or if it was just the result of breathing in toxic fumes from their primitive, poorly ventilated clay hearths. You step closer to the dairy hearth, leaning your shoulder against a smooth, cold oak beam as the dry heat of the dying wood fire warms your hands and chest. The atmosphere inside the dairy shed is incredibly cozy and silent, a peaceful sanctuary filled with the heavy, comforting smells of warm milk, clean straw, aged wood, and the deep, savory tang of fermenting curds. You watch the plowman take a bite of his melted cheese, the gooey white strands stretching out like a web before snapping softly in the dim light. The sheer density of the fat and salt hits his system like a physical wave, bringing an instant, visible relaxation to his weather-beaten face. It is a slow, deeply hypnotic scene. The rhythmic crackle, pop of the remaining wood embers mixing with the low, steady sighing of the wind outside the cracks in the wooden walls, making your own eyelids feel incredibly heavy and relaxed with every breath you take. For the wealthy elites, eating this heavy peasant cheese was seen as a dangerous, vulgar indulgence that could clog your stomach and corrupt your internal humors. Courtly etiquette books actually warned nobles that cheese should only be eaten in tiny, paper-thin slices at the very end of a meal to seal the stomach shut, much like a lid on a pot. But the common folk ignored the elite warnings, gorging on cheese curds at every single meal, using it to flavor their porridges, baking it into dense tarts, or simply carrying a hard wedge of it in their pockets to chew on like savory gum throughout their long working hours. If a dairy merchant in the public market tried to cheat the poor by selling cheese that had secretly been watered down with sour whey, or if they hid maggot-infested curds in the center of a fresh wheel, the local bailiff would show absolutely no mercy. The dishonest seller would be hauled to the town pillory, and the rotten, smelly cheese would be smashed directly into their face, left to dry and crust under the hot sun, while the townspeople jeered at their greed. You watch the old milkmaid blow out her candle, plunging the dairy shed into a soft, velvety darkness, lit only by the faint red glow of the dying coals, as your feet prepare to take you on one final, peaceful midnight stroll through a sleeping medieval world. The soft, velvety darkness of the dairy shed embraces you as you slip out into the crisp night air, initiating your final, peaceful midnight stroll through the quietly sleeping city. The rowdy students, the busy pastry cooks, the wealthy merchants, and the tired pilgrims have all retreated behind heavy wooden doors, leaving the labyrinth of cobblestone streets entirely to you and the stars. The air is remarkably clear now, washed clean by the light drizzle from earlier, and it carries a gentle, grounding scent of damp stone, fading wood smoke, and the faint, sweet memory of toasted sugar that still hangs invisibly in the rafters of the market stalls. You walk slowly, without any rush or destination, watching the moonlight pool in the shallow grooves of the wet cobblestones like tiny silver mirrors reflecting a completely still sky. There is a profound, comforting rhythm to a medieval city when its fires die down and its voices go quiet. You watch the night watchman walk past at the end of the alley, his heavy iron lantern swinging in a slow, hypnotic arc that casts long, lazy shadows against the ancient timber framed walls. He doesn't say a word, he just gives you a brief, reassuring nod before disappearing into the mist, the soft, rhythmic clack, thud of his leather boots fading away until it completely merges with the natural silence of the night. This final hour belongs entirely to the architecture of the past, to the massive stone buttresses of the cathedral and the sleepy wooden shutters of the fast food stalls that were so full of chaotic life just hours ago. Historians still debate whether medieval people slept in a single solid 8-hour block like we do today, or if they practiced a natural two-stage sleep pattern, waking up for a quiet hour of reading, snacking, or talking in the middle of the night before drifting back into a deep secondary rest. You stop for a moment to lean against a smooth, cool stone archway, letting your eyes drift shut as you breathe in the cool, silent air. The frantic energy of the day, the shouting pie bakers, the sizzling fish vats, the intense heat of the waffle irons, and the rich, complex flavors of the midnight stews has completely dissolved into the background, leaving behind a deep sense of stillness and historical comfort. You realize that beneath the strange laws, the bizarre ingredients, and the lack of modern refrigeration, these ancient street vendors were providing something much more important than just quick calories. They were creating small spaces of warmth, flavor, and human connection for a world that was often cold and exhausting. As you open your eyes, the silver moonlight seems to soften even further, blurring the sharp edges of the wooden roofs and casting a hazy, dreamlike glow over the entire sleeping town. The distant, lonely hoot of an owl nesting in the church tower echoes softly through the empty lanes, a gentle reminder that the night is deep, secure, and perfectly at peace. Your mind feels completely unburdened, entirely settled by the steady, slow-paced journey through the tastes and textures of this forgotten culinary world. The rich, heavy comforts of the past wrap around your senses like a thick, hand-woven wool blanket, slowing your heartbeat and clearing away the lingering noise of the modern world. Every shadow becomes a soft cushion, every quiet alleyway an invitation to rest, as the entire historic landscape slowly fades into a gentle, velvety sea of quiet tranquility. The last glowing ember in the marketplace blacksmith's forge blinks out, leaving the world in a state of pure, undisturbed rest. The damp cobblestones, the ancient wooden beams, and the winding rivers are all sleeping now, cradled by the deep, dark night. There are no more stories to tell, no more steps to take, and no more paths to follow. Everything is still. Everything is warm.